Well, good morning or good afternoon or wherever you are, anywhere. We've got a huge audience here for this particular broadcast, which is about obviously turning job descriptions into role descriptions fairly easily. So I'm sure you're here for all sorts of reasons, so I'd be keen to know how I might be able to assist. But I think before we go any further, if you could just indicate, please, just type in the word clear or I can hear you or something like that in the question box so that I know that I'm coming across loud and clear to everyone. Great, thank you. All right, thanks. Good, good, excellent. Sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is great. So I wrote the book, The End of the Job Description, a year or two ago because I think all of us at some stage have been frustrated with this whole idea of job descriptions and the fact that it doesn't seem to capture everything that we want people to do at work. But yet we need the job description because it's a legally defensible document, and often when we have to terminate someone's employment, we often turn to the job description as some legal defence. So it's kind of like something we need, but on the other hand, we're not completely comfortable about whether it's working the way we'd like it to work. So I'm hoping that I can give you a little bit of a thought-provoking approach here that could help you improve the work document and to turn it from a job description to a role description. So look, I'm keen to hear what you'd like to get out of the process. So if you've got a moment there, please just type in what's the key question that you'd like me to answer during this hour, because I'll shape the presentation towards the needs that you have in terms of what you might want. So if you could just type something in there, that would help greatly. By the way, if you've got questions throughout the presentation, I've packed a fair bit into the hour. Type them in as they go, so that what I'll do is I'll stop the presentation and I'll respond to your question. I'm the only one that'll see the question, but nevertheless I'll respond to it at the moment I see it. I've already got one coming in here from Jenny. What do you see as the difference between the role description and the role profile? Helping to deal with people who don't have tasks, yeah, okay. I'm going to look at that difference, Jenny, today, without a doubt. So I'll talk about the difference there. Got another question here in relation to, let me see. Okay, help dealing with a person who does the task but is a pain and difficult towards their work colleagues. Absolutely. Lindsay, I'm going to talk about the whole, what I would call non-job tasks that people are required to do in the workplace that often don't get captured in the job description. So basically what you're saying is, how do we look after people's performance that's perhaps not actually embedded in the job description? So I'll certainly be looking at that. Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to know how we would do this simply and most efficiently. Yeah, of course, it's a big issue. And that's what stops a lot of people, because they think, oh, I've got to start all again. Well, you don't. You actually can retrofit a framework that I'm going to share with you today to the job description and turn it into a role description. So it is in fact a lot easier to deal with. So okay, good. I've got a statement here. Interested in changing the job description to role within our organisation. Yep, I'm going to deal with that. How to frame a document that relates to traditional job roles as well as non-job roles. Yes, I'm going to deal with that. Thank you. How do you manage performance when the duties are not as clear? Okay, I will deal with key performance indicators around non-job tasks as well, albeit briefly, Sam. So I'll certainly be looking at that. Okay, so there's obviously a lot of interest there. So let's get underway. and look at what we're going to be covering in the process. Okay, so basically I want to cover three things in our presentation. I want to understand the value and importance of non-job roles that people play, and these are the things that are often downplayed in the job description. I want to talk about learning a process of actually converting the job descriptions into role descriptions, so I'm going to talk about that as well. And I'm also going to talk about some KPIs for the increasingly important roles people play in the workplace. So if we're going to have a KPI around being a team player, for example, where do we start? That's the sort of thing. And that's often what stops us from including these things in the same degree as we would the task roles that people play. So I will look at those, albeit briefly, during the presentation. All right, now we've got, I've mentioned this in a couple of presentations previously, but I think the most significant management consultant in history is this gentleman by the name of Frederick Taylor, who was an engineer who was called upon the assembly lines of the Ford Motor Company and others in the early part of the last century. And his task was to make the assembly line more efficient and effective. And essentially he went about that, and he did it with great success. But a lot of his principles, of course, are still being used today. But essentially what he did, of course, was he chopped up the assembly line into small bite-sized pieces, and he looked at the one best way of doing each particular job. So the one best way of putting the tyres on the car, the one best way of putting the paintwork on the car, the one best way of loading the engine into the car, and so forth, so that each person on that assembly line had a specific set of tasks to do. And not only did they have a specific set of tasks to do, they had to do them in a certain way. So obviously born out of that was the concept of the job description. In other words, a specification of tasks that were required in order for someone to fulfill their job. So we've got Frederick Taylor to blame for the job description. But as I said, he's highly influential in the sense that we're still using a lot of his principles today, and we're using them even though the assembly line of the early part of the 20th century is entirely different from the workplace that we're dealing with right now. And that's why I'm calling for a change from job descriptions to role descriptions. And it's not just a play on words. It's not semantics. It's actually a complete change. It's a shift from moving from a shift or a focus on the job to a focus on performance, and there is a difference. All right, now I think the job description is used as a bit of parody in lots of organisations, and some of the sitcoms like The Office and so forth, where we have this disclaimer at the bottom of the job description that basically says this: you're required to complete any other tasks or duties not on this job description deemed relevant by your manager. So you kind of ask yourself the question, well, if it can't be put on the job description, what else could there be? And another question might be, well, why bother even having a job description if we can't capture everything on that document? And so we see this at the end of the job description, usually at the end as a legal disclaimer to basically cover ourselves to make sure that we have captured everything, even though we haven't necessarily captured it. So it's a bit of an interesting little task that we have there that we do. So anyway, so here is a framework that wouldn't be unfamiliar with you, but one of the frameworks that I put in my book, The End of the Job Description, is just so that we position the job description, or in my case, the role description, correctly. Let's have a look. So organisations, of course, have a vision statement, which is essentially an aspirational statement about where the organisation wants to go. Usually those statements are too long in my experience. They should be encapsulated in one simple sentence. Then we have a mission statement, and the mission statement is essentially the how do we actually get to our vision. And so we have a statement of where we want to go, we have a statement of how we're going to get there, and usually most organisations now have a set of core values, and those values are the behaviours that govern the way we go about our vision and our mission and our vision. Now, usually they're put together in the office of the manager or a group of managers, and often they're ignored by the rest of the workplace, but that's a whole nother webinar in itself, which I can talk about in future. Then we have the role description, or you can substitute the word role and job there. So we have the job description, which is essentially should be an expression of the vision, the mission, and the values of an organisation. So in other words, they should be completely aligned with what we're trying to aspire to, how we might get there, and the behaviours that we expect people to behave in order to get to that particular vision. Then, of course, within the role description or the job description, we have some key result areas, and normally they're around 6 to 8. Any more than that, and it sort of gets a bit murky and we lose sight of what we're there for. So essentially we have about 6 to 8 is conventional wisdom around these clusters of activities around what people should be doing in their work. So I don't fault that at all. I think that's a sensible way to go, because people need to understand what they're accountable for. And within those key result areas, we have key performance indicators. And KPIs, of course, are the ways to which we measure success in each of those key result areas. And we sometimes get confused between KPIs and targets. KPIs, or key performance indicators, are the how, and the last part of the framework is the what. The what are the targets. Now, not every target can be numerically expressed. So some targets have to be expressed as qualitative statements rather than quantitative statements. And in other words, to follow the system or to adhere to a particular approach. So really your framework in your organisation should cover each of those particular areas. Now the focus, of course, is in that area in the middle there, which is the role description, but you know, you might want to go back and have a look at your vision, mission and core values, but the job description or role description is really a small bite-sized piece of a much larger chunk of activity, which of course is the aspirational vision of what the organisation is trying to achieve. So it's good for us to just position where this particular work document fits before we go any further. All right, so now one of the things that I say or write about in the book in the early stages is that there's been an evolution of the job description. The job description started out as what I would call first generation, which started out after the scientific management of the early part of the last century, where it simply listed the tasks required. So the first generation job description was essentially a list of tasks that were required by the job holder. Now we've moved past that, of course, but the tasks and you know, in bullet point form listed down on a piece of paper would be what I would refer to as the first generation job description. Although I have to say that what I've seen in the workplace, in some places, without mentioning names, of course, I would still classify them as first generation job descriptions, because it's really just listing the tasks and there's nothing else there to indicate how those tasks might be performed. Now, the second generation of job descriptions was where the focus was moving away from the job towards the job holder, in other words, the individual. And the second generation was around job competencies. So within this particular generation, we have particular measures or key performance indicators around how people, that is the job holder, was expected to perform that task. So the big difference between the first and the second generation is the key performance indicators and perhaps even the key performance areas. And a lot of organisations are still operating in the second generation. So what I'm suggesting here is that we move to the third generation, which is now a focus on the organisation. So we've gone from job to individual and now the organisation. In other words, we should be focusing on the non-job roles that people are expected to play, as well as the job roles, so that the role description is actually a combination of both the non-job and job roles that people are expected to play in the workplace. Now, some of you, I can almost hear you saying, well, we already do that. But I would say to you that probably what happens in a lot of these particular work documents is that at the end of the document, we have some bullet points around the non-job roles that people are expected to play. So in other words, when the job holder picks up that piece of paper, what they notice is that there's far more detail around the job competencies than there are on the non-job competencies, and it's almost like it's an afterthought at the end. Now, I would argue that we need to elevate the non-job roles to the same status as the job roles. And by doing that, we're creating a third generation document, which I refer to as a role description. So essentially what I'm trying to do here in this short session is to assist you to move from second to third generation. And if you think you're actually at third generation, perhaps I can give you some tips and hints on how to make the document even more meaningful. All right, moving right along. Now, one of the reasons that I'm against the job description as it's written, as it's, you know, that second generation document that I mentioned, is that it governs every single thing we do at work, and that's okay. But of course, what happens is if the focus is on the technical requirements of the job, which essentially it is, then that's going to colour all of the human resource management practices that we have in the workplace. So you can see on your screen there, when we recruit and select people for jobs, the focus is very much on the technical aspects of the job. So what happens in the interview, of course, is that we sit there and we ask people a bunch of questions that are specific to the technical requirements of the job. Now, I don't personally have a problem with that, but what actually happens is that after probation or around 3 months into the job, we find that the person's a difficult person to deal with, or, you know, they're not a team player, or they're not committed to growing and developing, and we wonder why, you know, this wasn't picked up earlier. And one of the reasons it wasn't picked up earlier is because we didn't ask too many questions about it. We were too focused on the technical requirements of the job specification. And then when we induct people, we tend to show people how to do the work. That's the technical requirements. We don't talk too much about values and culture and expectations around that. Again, the job description colours that. And then when we send people off to training and development, often what we do is we send people off to technical programs. And again, there's no problem with that, but I'd suggest that 80% of the programs that we send people off to are about helping people enhance their technical requirements embedded in the job description. So very little emphasis on problem solving, very little emphasis on personal development. And then when we remunerate people, of course, we do that on the basis of how people are performing technically. And again, they could be doing lots of things right technically, but in the non-technical area, or the non-job roles that I'm going to share with you shortly, they might be falling short. But nevertheless, our measure is how they're achieving their technical requirements of their job. And then, of course, when we want to promote people, we tend to promote people on their technical competence. And then, as we all know, when we want to promote someone to a leadership role, we tend to do it on the basis of their good technical qualifications rather than whether they have the aptitude or the skills to be a good leader. And then when we review performance, we sit down and review people on the basis of how they've performed in their job description. And when we terminate people, which is probably another chunk of activity I haven't included here, we'll try to do that on the basis of demonstrating that that person hasn't been performing their job tasks, even though in fact it may be other reasons or problems that are non-job related as to why we need to get rid of that person. So you can see that the job description does create a huge amount of issues for us in our workplace around performance when we consider it from the point of view of human resource management practices. So that's why I'm advocating we move away from the job description to the role description as such. All right, so I'm going to make what might on the surface seem like a provocative statement, but I would say to you that the roles that people play in organisations, that's the organisations you're from, are more important than the jobs they do, which might sound a little bit provocative, but I want to elevate this whole concept of the non-job task to its rightful place in the work document and demonstrate how important the non-job roles are. Now, people have been grappling with non-job roles for quite a period of time. In fact, the last 25 years, people have been considering, well, what really is relevant? What are the relevant non-job roles for all industries? So if we went into the public sector, or we went into an administrative job, or we went into a sales job, or we went into a building and construction role, what are the non-job roles that people are expected to play regardless of the technical requirements of the job? That whole question really did interest me a lot. And I thought that because there was so much procrastination around that, that I would try to look at what these non-job roles, these generic non-job roles would be. So what I have come up with is, this will come up on your screen shortly. So what I have come up with is that the work that people do is two-dimensional. So there's one dimension that is job-based, all right, and this is what I call the job role. These are the technical requirements of what people need to do in order to do their job effectively, regardless of what the job is. Now, that information, of course, is captured in our job description. So that's pretty much covered. And the good news for you is that you don't need to go and rewrite that. That's basically, assuming, of course, it's been pretty well written, and there's question marks, I guess, around that, but let's assume that it's been well documented, then we've got that role covered. But that's, I would argue, one of only 5 roles that people ought to play in the world of work, regardless of the industry that they're from. So the other dimension in this is what I would call the non-job role dimension. So what I'm going to do now is give you a framework to start to look at your own non-job roles in your own workplace, and I would suspect that these will be relevant to your work. And we've got an enormous number of people in this broadcast today and covering quite a lot of industries. But let's have a look. One of the non-job roles that I think is critically important is for people to display a positive attitude and enthusiasm to their work. Now, by that, I'm not referring to people bouncing off the walls with great enthusiasm every moment of every day. That's not realistic. But what I'm suggesting to you is that we don't want people whinging and whining and complaining and pointing the finger of blame and all of that kind of activity, which I would argue is negative energy and negative behaviour in the workplace. I would challenge you to think about this. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be expecting people come to work with the right frame of mind. We all have our bad days, and we will continue to have our bad days. But for someone to come to work who's chronically negative is a huge drain, not only on you, but also everybody else that happens to work with them. I'm sure you'd agree with that. But one of the problems here is that people will often say, and when they're challenged about this, they'll often say, well, look, I come to work, I do my job that's required on my job description, and I admit that I'm a difficult person, but so what? I do my job. Well, my suggestion is that it has an impact on performance, sometimes directly and often indirectly. So I think that should be a non-job role that people are required to play. And some of you might be thinking to yourself, well, how do we measure that? Well, it's not as difficult as you might think. I could guarantee to you that if we all were sitting in a room and we were watching a video of somebody performing work who had a negative attitude, I think we would all agree on that. In other words, it's not that difficult to agree on those sorts of things. And if we saw another video of someone performing their work with a reasonably positive mindset, we could probably also agree on that as well. So it's not quite as difficult as we might think. And in the book, I list 10 key performance indicators around that, and I'll share some of that with you later. The second particular non-job role that's critically important in this day and age, because our hierarchies are flatter and we are expected to work with people cross-functionally far more than we did perhaps in the last century, we expect people to come to work and work in teams. We expect people to be team players, and I don't think there's anything unreasonable about that expectation. But again, we don't often flesh that out in the role document, so that people can often feel justified in being an individual at work, and they'll often say things like, well, you know what, I'm not a team player, but I get my job done. Well, to me, that's unacceptable, because the fact of the matter is nobody does work in a vacuum, and we expect people to be working with other people. So we expect people to work in teams, and we expect that as a critically important part of performance. The third element that we expect of people, I think, in the workplace, right across, and I work across 21 industries, and I can't think that any of these aren't relevant to any of those 21 industries. We expect people to continually upskill. We expect people to come to work and continually develop their skill sets, update their particular knowledge and know-how, because of course the world is moving so fast and things are changing so quickly. So we want people to do that. But isn't it interesting how a lot of people will say to us at work, oh, look, I don't want to be sent on that training program, or that's not applicable to me because I'm quite happy just to be using this kind of approach. Or another comment that people will often make is, look, I'm too old to learn. Perhaps you might send somebody younger on the training program or whatever. I don't think it's an unreasonable expectation that we expect people to come to work willing to grow and develop as individuals. And it's not just for the organisation's sake, it's for their sake as well, because obviously from a career perspective, people who have stopped growing and developing are actually going to go backwards. So this isn't really about what's best for the organisation only, it's also what's best for the individual. So obviously we want people to grow and develop in role, and I think that's a fair and reasonable non-job role for people to play in the world of work in the 21st century. And finally, we want people to bring their ideas to work with them. We want people to be enterprising. We want people to continuously improve. We want people to bring their ideas to work to help the organisation be more efficient and effective. And of course, we struggle with that, don't we? And a lot of the reason we struggle with that is because people in their work document, it doesn't say anything about that. So if it doesn't say anything about that, it doesn't spell it out in detail, then why would anybody be interested in adhering to that? But whereas the skill development is about people developing themselves, the innovation and continuous improvement role is about people developing their workplace. So if you doubt the relevance of these 4 non-job roles, just think about a workplace where everybody was there with a negative attitude. None of them wanted to work as part of a team. They all had stopped developing their own skill sets, and none of them brought any ideas or opportunities to work to improve the workplace. What sort of workplace would that be? Well, I can tell you it wouldn't matter what the skill sets were like. It would be a non-productive workplace. So these 4 non-job roles are critically important, and what I'm suggesting to you is that you retrofit these 4 non-job roles to the job role. So essentially what happens is that an employee has 5 roles they're expected to play in the workplace. They have a job role, they have a positive attitude and enthusiasm role, they have a team role, they have a skill development role, and they have an innovation and continuous improvement role. So 5 things of equal status that they bring with them to work. And that's what the role description is, and fundamentally the difference between a role description and a job description. Okay, so if you doubt the relevance of those 4 non-job roles, and I suspect you probably don't, consider some research that was done by Warner in 2012 when Warner went out and spoke to a number of managers, and this was across several industries, and he simply asked these managers to identify what they perceived to be the number 1 job attribute that they wanted in new recruits. So when somebody started in a job, irrespective of the industry, here is the 10 most valued job attributes from this research from 9,000 managers. I'll put them all up and then we can have a chat about them, and that'll come up in your screen, on your screen. There it is. Oh, gone again. There it is. Okay, so if you cast your eyes down that list of 10 things there, I don't see anything there that relates to the technical requirements of what people are expected to do at work. So if you have a look at the list, they're all non-job roles. They're all things that people are expected to bring with them that aren't necessarily technical requirements of the work that they do. So I guess what I'm trying to do is just highlight how critically important we value non-job roles, and yet the work document that we use at very best gives lip service to the non-job roles. And I know some of you have made some effort in this area, but I would suggest to you that we need to elevate the status of these non-job roles to the same level that we elevate the status of job tasks. Now, if we do that, then we're broadening the dimension of performance beyond just the job to performance in general. And that's what I'm getting to, and that's why I believe this is so important. So there you have it, 10 non-job roles that are critically important. So one of the questions that I had earlier was around the difference between a job role and a role description. So let's have a look at, a job description and a role description. So look, this is my definition. You'll find other definitions out there, but this is how I would define the difference. So a job role is usually defined as a set of specific tasks and responsibilities that are performed by a particular job holder. So that's what we probably would, in essence, say is a job description. On the other hand, I would argue that a role description defines the job role, which is the technical requirements, and the non-job roles that employees are expected to perform at work. So it's a broader dimension of performance that goes beyond the technical requirements of what people do at work. So when I say that it's easy to move from a job description to a role description, what I mean by that is that we don't need to change anything really around the technical tasks and responsibilities. They stay the same. No one's suggesting they change. And assuming, as I said before, that they're written fairly well, then you don't have to do a thing. What you need to do then is you then value add and flesh out the non-job roles, and I've given you a framework for doing that, which is the four non-job roles I've shared with you. There's probably more than four, and there's no reason why you can't add additional non-job roles, but I believe that those four are a good starting point, and that's why it's a good framework. So if you're really interested in moving from a job description to a role description, I would just embed those four non-job roles into your work document, and you're moving in the right direction. You don't need to complicate things too much. So that's essentially the difference, and I hope that sort of answered the question that we had earlier. I'm just checking to see if we've got any other questions here. Right. Okay. How do we sell the benefits of the change from a job role to a role description, both to management and to the workers? Good question, Therese. Look, I don't think people will. I mean, it's common sense, isn't it, that we should be capturing the non-job roles in a work document. And one of the ways to sell that is to get the organisation involved in reshaping the work document to reflect a role description. And you can see, for example, on a previous slide that managers do value non-job roles. I'm sure you do. I'm sure everybody does. And one of the reasons we don't have high performance in those non-job roles is because we don't really focus on it. The job description doesn't really cover them in any great detail, and that's problematic. So I think the way to get people involved is to actually share with them the framework that I've shared with you. You'll get these slides at the end, and you'll get a video of this as well, and you can certainly talk to them about those sorts of things. I don't think it's a hard sell, but it's really making the work document, far more comprehensive. And I think most people would agree that that's important. So James asks, how do we avoid having too many key performance indicators given more job description headings? Yeah, look, I think, okay, so if you've got sort of 6 to 8 tasks, headings, yeah, sure, you'll be adding some more, that's true. But isn't there an expectation anyway that people should be team players? Tacit, nevertheless. Isn't there an expectation that people will bring their ideas to work? Isn't there an expectation that people will grow and develop? Isn't there an expectation that people will be generally reasonably pleasant to work with? I mean, generally we have these in our heads anyway. So all we're doing is putting it on paper. So we're giving people a more comprehensive view of what our expectations as managers are of people at work. So yes, it does extend the document, but what's the problem with that? Because by not putting it in there, we just get frustrated when people violate those non-job roles, and then of course we have to try and find some job-related reason, perhaps for showing them the door, so that we can have a legally defensible reason. This way, we can have a legally defensible system where people are violating non-job roles rather than just job roles. So I think it's actually a good thing to be more explicit about what people are expected in the workplace. So, James, I hope that's answered your question. Okay, so let's have a look at these non-job roles in a little bit more detail. And if you want more information about the key performance indicators, I've actually highlighted 10 in each. So I've broken down these non-job roles into these headings, and what I call elements. And I'll just put them up and then I'll talk about them. That'll come up in your screen shortly. So if we look at a positive attitude and enthusiasm as a role, a non-job role, what am I actually talking about there in very tangible terms? Well, I think probably three things. If somebody was demonstrating to me that they had a positive attitude and enthusiasm in their work, I would probably be expecting at least three elements in their behaviour. I'd be expecting that they were solution focused, and what I mean by that is that they're looking for solutions and not just pointing fingers of blame and deferring to leaders. I'd be looking for people to show some degree of autonomy. In other words, that I don't have to be sort of breathing down their neck for them to get their performance done. I'd be also looking for a sense of positive energy. I would want those people to be reasonably positive in their cooperation and work and collaboration with other people. So I'd be expecting those things. And then what I've done in the book is I've broken those three things down, which you would argue these could be elements, and I've broken these down into 10 key performance indicators. So there are a number of key performance indicators, and you can just select the ones that are applicable to your work. In terms of the team role, let me just put these up for a moment and then I will refer to them. Whoop, went too far. I'll go back. Okay, in the team role, there are only two things that I think are important for people to be exhibiting the team role. One is that they're showing some leadership, and what I mean by that is that not passively sitting there waiting to be told what to do, but they're willing to influence others. Whether they're effective or not is another thing, but they see their role as being active in the team. And I also believe that they show a degree of accountability, not just for their own work, but also for the work of the team, and not just point fingers of blame. So self-leadership and accountability are the two elements that I think are critically important in the team role. And then again, as I said before in the book, I outline a number of key performance indicators and break it down into very tangible. I'll share a set of those with you shortly. We've just got another question coming in here. I'll just go back if I just get the question. Okay, non-job roles can be subjective. If you have a highly functioning manager who can work under pressure, some team members may not keep up with the manager's definition of what working under pressure. How do you manage this in a legally defensible way? Good question. How you do this is you get the people in the teams to come up with the definitions of what these look like. Instead of the manager crafting the role description, you get the team to do this. So I'll explain that a bit further. So what I'm after is the team to come up with the ways and means of what this means for them as a team. So I'm looking for very practical ways of doing that. And of course, even job roles can be seen to be subjective as well. But yes, and then the manager is, it's up to them to manage performance based on what the team see to be a reasonable level or a reasonable acceptable level of performance around these non-job roles. I'm not suggesting it's not challenging, but I'm also suggesting that just because it is a little bit challenging, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be having an attempt at it. Because I think that if we don't attempt to try to quantify and qualify what these non-job roles are, then any behaviour is acceptable, and that's disappointing. And it's even more disappointing than somebody arguing about whether or not they've met the crossbar around a non-job role. Okay. When I hire, another question here, when I hire, I always focus on the non-job technical role, but they are not mentioned in any of the job descriptions that I develop. This is great. Okay, well, thanks for that feedback. I'm hoping that will help. Moving on to the skill development role, I'll put these up and then we can have a chat about them. There are two elements that I have identified that are critically important in the skill development role. One of those is self-development. I want people to demonstrate some personal development. How does one develop themselves in the workplace? Because personal development is critically important, but of course so is technical development. So I split those two up into self-development and technical development. Technical development, of course, is to do with how they perform their job role more effectively, and their self-development is around them as people. So I'm looking for a balance between the two, and if one of those is imbalanced, then I can give feedback to someone about the fact that they need to do more self-development, or perhaps their technical development needs to be improved. So it gives you some clarity around how you might deal with that particular non-job role. And finally, and mindful we've got so many people in this broadcast, and the fact that we've got so much interest in questions, I do want to give people a chance to ask questions. So when I'm talking about the fourth non-job role, which is innovation and continuous improvement, I guess there are two things I'm interested in there. I'm interested in problem solving and critical thinking. I want people to be able to think for themselves, and I want people to be able to think critically. And what I find really interesting is very few people can do that. And and one of the reasons for that is because we give people templates. We give people a particular prescription about how they're supposed to do their job. We're still acting as if Taylor was on the assembly line. So, you must do things in this certain way. And then, of course, we turn around and say, but we also want you to be enterprising. We also want you to be creative. We also want you to be showing your initiative. Well, people can do both. And we should be looking for people to do both. And this is what we call ambidextrous organisation, where on the one hand we have people who comply, but on the other hand we have people who are also enterprising. And that's the big challenge for us, of course. Now, the second one there is the customer responsiveness. You might say, well, that's interesting. How could you link it back to customers? Well, at the end of the day, a lot of the need to be innovative and continuously improving is actually about improving the quality of the service or the products that we provide our customers. So if we anchor it back to the customer, we can then start to measure innovation and continuous improvement activity around whether it actually helps responsiveness to the customer or not. So that's why I've anchored it back to the customer. So another slide here just on innovation and continuous improvement. Everything in your organisation is open to innovation and continuous improvement. And I think sometimes we get sort of flummoxed by this word innovation, but look, the places to start obviously are the big picture things, the things that we spend time on regularly each day. So how about this for a list? You've got things that are, how can we improve quality? How can we reduce the time on something? How can we reduce the costs? How can we increase the output? How can we increase safety? How can we better meet deadlines? How can we enhance our interpersonal cooperation between the various teams? And how can we streamline systems and processes? Now, all of these things are open to innovation and continuous improvement, But unless you target and focus questions around that, then what happens is that people just sit there blankly, they don't have any ideas, and you get the idea that people aren't really interested, and then what happens is that you fill the void. And of course the person sits there and thinks, well, there you go, the manager wasn't really interested in my ideas at all, which is called the initiative paradox, which I'll talk about in a future broadcast. All right, now what I'm putting on the screen now, and it'll come up shortly for you, is just a sample from the book, a table from the book, just to show you how I've actually broken down this. So, for example, you'll notice up the top it says element, taking responsibility. All right, so that's one of the that's one of the elements for a positive mental attitude, right? Taking responsibility, that's an element. So I've got 10 key performance indicators around that. So you can see I usually complete tasks on time and a high standard. I take initiative and complete tasks without being asked to do that. Now, you can actually get people to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 around those tasks, around those indicators. You, as the manager, if you are the manager, can also rate them around that. And of course, if you wanted to use 360-degree feedback, you could also get some of your colleagues or the person's colleagues to rate them as well, so that I get a very good sample cross-section of the organisation about whether people are fulfilling these key performance indicators. And obviously, if someone rates a 5 in all of these areas, you could probably argue that they're going above and beyond the requirements of taking responsibility, which is an element of that positive mental attitude and enthusiasm area. So you can actually, these have all been done for you, and I've designed them in such a way as that they're fairly generic, so you could apply them, I think, pretty easily to your workplace. You might change a word here and there, but there's no reason why you can't do that, and there's no reason why you can't get your team involved in that process as well, so that they own the information that's coming out of this. So I just wanted to start to come towards the end and finish and say, well, okay, well, how do you go about it? All right, you now know the concept. So how do we actually go about administering this? You've got basically 4 ways. You've got, and I'll run through each of these with you briefly. There's obviously more information in the book. You can use what I call the dynamic duo method, and the dynamic duo method means that if there are 2 people performing the same job in your workplace, for example, 2 customer service officers, then you ask them both to get together and you work through those non-job roles, you work through those elements, and you work through those key performance indicators that I've shared with you and are in the book, and you create and craft a role description from their current job description. In other words, you're just adding to what's already there. So if you that of course works really well when you've got 2 people in the team. Now, of course, if you've got several people who are doing the same tasks, say for example you have an engineer at 4 different sites, and that engineer has the same job description, you know, they each have the same job description, why not get the engineering team together and work through a process, if you're an HR or even the manager, where you come to an understanding about those non-job tasks. Or if you're the leader, you might have a supervisor incumbent method where you just sit down with the one person, because there happens to be only one person doing that job, and you work with them to come to a realization about what the non-job framework looks like in relation to their job, and you come to an agreement. And of course, if there's only one person that does the job and it's a highly specialized area, and that's very true in some of your occupations and professions, then you ask that person to design their job description, their role description, to meet the non-job requirements I've gone through. So there's a number of strategies, but the key point, folks, in all of this is that you get the job holders involved in the process so that they own the document. And then, of course, it's got much more likelihood to be accepted, as the question earlier on about how we sell this. If you get people involved in the process, they will be sold because people, of course, don't argue with their own data. So, folks, if you've got any questions, this is your chance. We've got a couple of minutes left before I finish up, and I'm sure there are others questions. Then go for your life, and I'll do what I can to answer them. Just while you're thinking about that, could I just point out to you that we've got I have a very popular series called a Lunch and Learn series. Our next one starts on the 19th of January, which isn't that far away despite the Christmas break. And for a very reasonable cost, and it is very reasonable, you can enroll in that program. So if you've got middle managers, supervisors, and you're looking to give them a crash course in leadership, this is a great opportunity to do that, where they can do this online, so you don't have all the costs of sending people away to a program. They get a video recording of the broadcasts. They get the slides. They get unlimited time with me online. They get homework to do. You can go to that website there at the bottom, and you can actually register online if you wish, or if you'd like more information, then you know where to find me. So that's one thing I'd like to share with you. I'd also like to suggest to you that if you're interested in my book, The End of the Job Description, and you'd like to know more about some of those KPIs and some of the rigor behind what I've spoken about today, then you can contact me directly via email. And if you do that, because you've been involved in this webinar today, I will give you a unique key. You can go onto my website and get a 20% discount on the book, and that offer will last for 24 hours. So you can send me an email if that's something that you would like to do. I'm more than happy then to send that out to you, and I'll sign the book for you, and it'll give you a much more comprehensive framework. And finally, if I may, is if you like this webinar and you'd like to be involved in other webinars, on my website, which is up on the right-hand side there, you will have a whole list of webinars for next year. I've got 12, one a month, and you can enroll in any of those free of charge, just like this one, and each of those will have the same, hopefully, content or similar sort of content or rigor, and you can go with those. So go to my website, www.winnersatwork.com.au, and just register online there for any of those webinars. All right, well, that's about it for me. I don't see too many other questions coming through, but if you do, what I suggest is that you just email me, and if I've missed any questions here, and I may well have done that, then just send me an email. I'm more than happy to answer those questions for you. So thanks, folks. I've enjoyed being with you for the duration of this webinar. I hope I've given you something thought-provoking, and I hope you'll be able to go away and apply those. So all the very best, and thank you, and good luck for the future.